Hi, Will, just in time prepping. How you guys doing today? Hey, it's Tuesday, and it's time for story time. Everybody ready? So, I was just looking a couple of paragraphs before, so I could kind of give you guys a lowdown. If you remember that Mark is in West Virginia, and he's trying to find his way home with his dog. So, in order to catch up to where we left off, I'm gonna go back. Let's see, one, two, three. I'm gonna go back 5 paragraphs. The last 5 paragraphs we read last week, just so it kind of catches you up on what's going on. Okay. Now, don't forget that if you want to listen to the book all the way through up to now, so you can catch up. You can do that by going into the playlist. I put the book into a playlist called Survivors by Angela White. So if you haven't listened to it yet or know what's going on, you can go back into the playlist and find it, okay? All right, let's get started for this morning. The screams were deafening, and there were other noises too. Ones that made him want to stick his guts up. But the gunfire was the clearest to his trained mind. Mark eased away from the walking corpses who were now firing out of reflex, mowing down others like themselves. Eyes wide and feet unsteady, Mark scanned for even one other survivor, but found only more breathing dead. He turned, suddenly sensing movement. Mark threw himself away from the outstretched fingers of a uniformed man tightly gripping a pistol. He tripped over the bloody pile and landed hard on his ass. Please, what happened? The soldier's deadened orbs dripped blood. It ran over his lashes and cheeks in small torrents, and Mark hesitated, almost overcome with the first ever case of panic. This wasn't a foreign land, it was America. I can hear you breathing, you know, the army man stated almost casually. Mark watched the scarlet drops roll from his dead sockets, creeping down his cheeks to hit the dirt before disappearing, all of it seeming to be happening in slow motion. War? A bomb? But where? North or south? Mark considered, aware that a muscle in the blind man's jaw had begun to twitch erratically while he waited for the answer. South. I thought so, the soldier's voice was without emotion. Thank you. Calmly, without any indication he was going to, the wounded man raised the gun to his mouth and pulled the trigger. Blood sprayed wildly, raining across Mark's face, and he took off running, trying not to scream and not sure if he was succeeding. Crunch! The sound of the water further destroying the debris it had collected pulled Mark from the flashback, and he wished the images would go away. He had begun moving carefully on foot after that, trekking determinedly to the family home, only to discover no one was there despite the funeral being set forth that very day. The house had no signs of hasty retreat, no letters of explanation, and there were no fresh graves at the family plot. What happened? Mark swept the city limits of Franklin, drawn to the hills. He lingered on the cemetery, its iron gates surrounded by decaying bodies. Few of them wrapped. No one had known what to do with their dead. Neither had Mark. He almost hadn't come at all. I'm sorry, Marine, the base commander clapped him on the shoulder and said sympathetically. Mark stuffed a legal letter into the garbage can they were standing next to as the other men moved by. Drill calls and mess bells echoed throughout the brick halls of the base. Thank you, sir. His superior regarded him for a long moment, clearly unsure of the man's mood. I've scheduled your leave for the funeral. Starts ASAP. Mark wasn't sure if he would go, wasn't sure why he suddenly felt like a little kid afraid of the dark. It was just his mother. Thank you, sir, he repeated automatically. She, the visitor, and refused last month. Yes, sir. Mark didn't offer any details, even though he knew the base commander didn't take a personal interest in anyone. He had refused Mary's visit every time she came. Hadn't spoke to her, even by mail, in over a decade. And now that she was dead, he still hated her. Because of what she'd cost him the last time they'd seen each other. Was right before his first hitch was up. Thanks to the threat of charges being filed, he hadn't been allowed to leave the base before then, and that final conversation had been short and cold. So you can come home now, Mary said as she viewed him. Mark was silent as he sat stiffly across from her. The harlot ran the heathen city right after you. Came here, so won't be temptation, but you'll have to. No, her age-line face flew to his, and then in the hands on the table that were clenching in anger. No what? Mark leaned closer, loathing her. She hadn't changed. Her glasses were still crooked. Her face just as indifferent. He read no regret or even understanding in her cold blue depths. No caring for the life that she had taken. Denied him. I'm not coming home, ever. Her expression stunned, and Mary's hand fell to the sworn Bible in her lap, and Mark stood up. You put me here, took away what I loved, and now that I'm 21, I don't need you or have to listen to you. Forget my name. You're dead to me. Crack! Mark spun, 45 in hand, and the wolf bristled alertly at his side. The reeking water was destroying more debris than was flowing downstream, and Mark took his head at his jumpiness. He got moving again toward the white church that was a mile away. He had taken a leave to attend his mother's funeral and instead found himself alone in the place that had never been his home. The only living thing he encountered was Dog, curled up in the front porch. The blood in his fur was still tacky. As if he knew I was coming, Mark thought of the window the wolf had broken through. The torn basement was the only damage he'd found in the whole house. Not even the door had been kicked in, so he didn't think his family had been taken in the draft. The fact that they had put the dog in the basement... Hold it on, guys. Sorry about that. Not even the door was kicked in, so he didn't think his family had been taken in the draft. The fact that they had put the dog in the basement suggested something darker, but he pushed the renegade thoughts away, not feeling the urge to search for any of them. They hadn't been true family in a long time. If they had found safety and hadn't wanted him there, so be it. They were the last group of the people he would want to survive with anyway. And I'll stop here to apologize for just a minute ago. The computer I'm reading off of blinked off. Guilt and awful loneliness reared its head, reminding him it hadn't yet gone away, and Mark forced himself to lock down on those thoughts as he taught others to do. For them, it was to keep them from being distracted and blowing their mission. He did it now to keep from drowning under a tide of guilt. First waves of emotion threatened, and Mark forced his mind away again, hating that tiny, ashamed part of him that was glad that she had died unhappy. He had spent more than a decade living that way, and it was only fair his mother should feel some of it, since she was the one responsible. Mark had wandered a little after discovering nothing at home, But it hadn't taken long for him to become restless and start hunting for people for his own kind. He had once been sworn to his country, and while he still wore his tag beneath his fatigued shirt and long black leather trench coat, the America he had served was busy dying. It was crushing that there was nothing he could do to stop it. Mark had no real desire to return to his base in New Mexico either, and now the future was so grim. He was sure he wouldn't. The whole world was foobar, fucked up beyond any recognition. Everything he had ever known was gone. Are you sure? The cold wind pushed against him, mocked him as they proceeded up the last quarter of the steep hillside at a quick pace. He looked down at the big wolf. Hell of a start to the day, dog. The animal peered up at the sound of Mark's voice and then resumed smelling the bare, damp ground. The wolf didn't follow any of the scents he picked up, though, and kept heeling as if he were a well-trained pet, though one could tell at first glance he wasn't. Where to go next was the most pressing choice now. Mark wasn't worried about losing his supplies and transportation, though he would miss the thick sleeper tonight. The rest of his preferred loadout was in the kit slung over his shoulder. Physically, he could do fine alone. He always had. Mentally, things were more complicated. He didn't like people, didn't need them, and most of the time, he didn't need a goal. The urge to serve his country was still there, and he couldn't do it by himself. He had a good idea where many of the survivors had gone. The heartbreaking notes and letters on cars, on doors, and blowing with the wind were everywhere, and they pulled at him. After the first dozen, Mark had forced himself not to read anymore, knowing if he did, he would spend the rest of his life trying to reunite those broken families. Most survivors had gone to ground. Caves and sewers were the most mentioned, but flooding and collapses made that feel like a bad choice. Even if the flooding missed them and the cold didn't freeze or starve them, the poisons now circling the globe were as big as a threat below as above the surface. How long would a contaminated planet allow them to survive, no matter where they were? Mark had slowly traveled northwest, checking places like White Sulphur Springs and the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, hoping to discover recent signs of normal, what a joke, life. But he was no longer expected to find large groups of people trying to rebuild together. It was more than the awful devastation that made him think. So it was what was missing. That worried him the most. The world felt and sounded empty. There were no noises other than the wind and the water. Not a single human voice or life continuing in the same tradition. And there were no signs of the bastards who let it all happen either. The government was still in attendance, and the people Mark had served for all those years would never sit idly by and let the survivors have control of the topside, poisoned or not. There should have been emergency broadcasts, signs, flyers, and people taking pictures, measuring and monitoring, all dressed in little white spacesuits. And yet, there was nothing. There should have been soldiers in jeeps, all with the itchy trigger fingers and the bullhorns giving orders and not really helping, but there was only silence. There should have been aid stations set up, Red Cross units overloaded with patients to be examined, tested, recorded, and left to die. The healthier ones would be kept close enough to force them to beg for handouts so the scientists could keep studying the effects. And Mark was suddenly sure he couldn't ever do that. would die first. Not that it mattered now. The government that had killed so many had likely died without them. Where to? He ran his head through his soaked black hair. Where would normal people gather? In stadiums or maybe even malls? Mark tensed suddenly, some part of him registering the change. A note to the wind that hadn't been there before. Almost as if someone was calling for him. Hunting. Marcus? He swung around, drawing drenched leathers as he searched in surprise for whoever he'd let sneak up on him. He frowned when he saw nothing but dogwood flowers and the decaying bodies of the two songbirds lying in the yellowish grass. He could have sworn. His heart thumped as his mind matched to face the voice coming up with the one he had banished to his dreams so long ago. "You'll love me forever?" the girl asked as she let go of the blanket, terrified to trust. The boy grinned as he pushed gently between her long legs. "Just that long, not a second more." The girl smiled happily, leaning over to meet his thrust. As he kissed her teenage body on fire, the boy knew instinctively nothing in his adult life would ever be this good. She was perfect. He would never let her go. Mark's heart clenched the old longing, and the wolf whined uneasily at his master's pain. It was a wound that time hadn't healed. Section 2. Pretty sad, huh? Finally reaching the small building on the hill, Mark fell into marine mode as he squared away the small church, empty thankfully, and the tiny shed that was attached. Once satisfied he was alone, he put down alarms. A Marine always carried an emergency kit, and Mark was aware that his training would make this new world easier for him than most. He'd been playing war for years. Mark exchanged fresh fatigues for his soaked, torn clothes and tied his holster snugly over his thighs while he changed. Mark listened, but heard nothing except the river that was already several feet around his distant maple trees and column-supported buildings. He hadn't thought to miss the sound of another human voice, and it was a surprise to the loner inside. Changed and warming up, he scanned the water, still rushing downstream, evaluating. His breathing was normal. Heart in his chest where it belonged, and other than a couple of bruises and scratches, he was unharmed, hadn't even swallowed any of the nasty liquid. He also still had his hat. The string tied around his neck had kept it from being washed away, and Mark tried hard not to dwell on what could have been. Had he reacted a little slower on the bridge, he would be dead. It was a hard new world, one where some days were harder than the others were. He had come 130 miles in 7 weeks since finding the family home deserted, and the bodies were what bothered him more than even the constant reek of smoke and rot. They were in every place he'd been, stores, stations, cars, and homes. Men and women and kids and elderly, all shocking to glimpse in even one American city, let alone all of them. Mark fought the urge to give them the burials they deserved, knowing that, as with the letters and the notes, if he even buried one, he would spend the rest of his life on it. The realistic inside knew that gradually, terribly, Mother Nature would run her course. The cadavers would all disappear into the ground, into dens and burrows, and then into hungry stomachs. But it would always be obvious that a harsh and violent struggle for survival had swept this country from coast to coast. So much death and destruction, even in places that had no actual bomb damage. Fires were the most common cause of the devastation. Town after town reduced to darkened, shadowy frames, the victims of arson. This new world is a bed-pisser's wet dream and a king horror novel, all mixed, Mark thought. He hated the helpless feelings it gave him to roll through these places. They reminded him of the nightmares of the walking dead from the bus and the soldiers who'd killed himself. In his dreams, the dead followed him relentlessly with their not-so-funny stumbling walk-pushing until the cold ocean waves lapped at his feet, the water the only place left to go. Mark sighed and lit a Winston with his hands that stank of fish rot. Where he was supposed to go, even the radiation was already showing up. The mice in West Virginia were twice their normal size, and Marcus? He didn't draw his drenched gun this time. There was no one around here. Mark waved a finger at the softly growing wolf to quiet him. Is someone there? He called away from feeling foolish. There was a hint of vanilla sweet and never forgotten floating by on the wind. Angie? There was only silence, and Mark grinned sadly. He'd been alone too long. He wasn't the last person she would call. There was no, Marcus, I need you. The words seemed to go right by his ear this time, searching, making his breath catch. Must be going nuts, he muttered, heart screaming in joyful recognition. You owe me. Mark winced at the accusation, the reminder, and stopped denying, understanding that the time he had feared and no longer longed for was here. Angie was finally calling, and his marker, and that debt would never be repaid. Not letting his practical male side get in the way, Mark closed his eyes and concentrated as he had taught him so long ago. He was unable to keep from wondering if the water had gotten him, and if this was the afterlife with an angel's voice leading him to hell. You can't go yet, not until you help me, help us. The voice in his mind, Angie's voice, it's Angie, was clear, as if they were on the phone. He found it helped to pretend they were as his headache increased, throbbing at his temples. Was he injured? It would explain this. Marcus, what do you need? My life back? Mark jerked as if he slept, thrown into the past, and the note of desperation in her voice pulled at the place in the heart where he was unable to resist. I need you. Will you come? As quickly as I can. This would be the fastest swoop he'd ever made. In addition, this fast journey over a short amount of time would be done alone, without the support of his team. Tell me where. Ohio? Cincinnati? Mark's heart pounded faster. He had been there once before, 2 weeks. Angie, maybe less. A relief blast of energy exploded from her end. Mark swayed on his feet as her light sank into him, stopping the aching. It had been 15 years since he'd felt it. You have to hurry. What's wrong? Are you okay? There was no answer, just a dead line. And though he tried repeatedly, there was only silence. Mark rubbed the wolf's tense ears, not missing the eagerness in the animal's golden orbs. Clearly, Dog had felt her pull too, and Mark struggled to control the hearts that had suddenly felt alive again. Angie had called for him. He had no reason to go on living. Well, we'll go into Chapter 6 next time. The chapter will be called The Enemy and the Traitor, and it will take place outside of Trinidad, Colorado. It will be a new player next time, you guys. So I hope you enjoyed it. We went way over what I had planned on going on the story. But I didn't want to stop till we got to the end of the chapter, so I guess it's just going to be a long video. Okay, you guys, I hope you guys sat there and enjoyed the video. I apologize again for that one part, but can't read what you can't see. Another thing is, don't forget we have the live stream in the morning. Be there, be square. Remember, you can't win on Saturday if you're not there, or if you're not there on Wednesday to get your name written down. Ah, that tastes so good after reading. Alright, you guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys out there on the tube.